Hey, do you have time to continue our Bishul talk?
Sure, let's do it.
In our last talk, we distinguished between heating up liquids or heating up solids, and we said we have to precisely define these concepts of davalach or davayavish, liquids and solids. What counts as a solid, what counts as a liquid, and where's the difference between them?
So as a brief review, we mentioned that the idea of bishul is to transform something and take something that was inedible and improve it and make it edible through heat. Now with the davalach, with something that's liquid, that gets undone pretty often once it cools down. However, something that's solid, it remains cooked. Doesn't really change, just now cold. For example, a piece of chicken that gets cooked, it's still a cooked piece of chicken, it's just cold now afterwards, as opposed to water that is not boiled anymore, that's not boiled water. So that's why there is a problem of reheating liquids, but not solids. So water versus a piece of schnitzel, those are pretty clear examples. What about things that are somewhat in between? So the Beis Yosef quotes one of the Rishonim who says it's defined by what's the majority. If the majority of the food is a solid, it's treated as a solid. If the majority of the food is a liquid, it's treated as a liquid. And this, in fact, is how Rav Yosef paskins. However, the Mishnah Berurah goes with the other Rishonim who disagree with this and say that it actually has to be dry. You can't have any liquid around. Rav Moshe also follows the opinion of the Mishnah Berurah. However, Rav Vosder and Rav Elyashiv, two of the great poskim in Eretz Yisrael in the 20th century, both note that when we say something has to be dry, it doesn't mean it has to be dried with a napkin and has absolutely no liquid droplets. It means you have to shake it off. So let's say you have a piece of chicken in the fridge, you have some sauce around it. As long as you shake off the sauce, that's okay. Even if a little bit of liquid gets heated up, that's not an issue. It's only an issue if it's really a liquid food. But you have a solid food that has a little bit of liquid on it, you could shake it off. A cholent will depend on the cholent. If it's a little bit more of a liquidy cholent, well, then it might be a davar. If it's a firmer, more solid cholent, then it would be a davar yavish, and you would be allowed to reheat it. But those in between, you have to figure out what is it really? Is it really more of a solid or of a liquid? But with the other items, as long as you shake off the sauce, that would be permitted to be reheated.
Okay, now I think we have to understand, though, what is considered heating? What exactly qualifies as cooking on Shabbos?
Well, the Mishnah discusses a pretty progressive way to cook, and that's to cook in the sun, solar heating. So what's the status of cooking? So the Mishnah says explicitly that this is permitted. It's a bit of a question why that is. Let's say you cooked an egg in the sun, why should it be mutter? So there's a machlokas poskim about this. Moshe Feinstein explains that since it's not normal to cook in the sun, it is permitted. Now, doing something in an abnormal manner is not always permitted outright. We've given the example in the past of turning on a light with your elbow. That's abnormal. It's still asur midirabanan. But in certain instances, we're not going to get into analyzing exactly when and why it is permitted. Rav Zalman Auerbach argues that no, that the definition of bishul is fire. And so there's just no way to have bishul outside of fire. The interesting nafkamina Moshe Feinstein discusses is that let's say you would have a normal way of cooking that wasn't through fire. And what his example that he gives is microwave. Perhaps microwave would become Bishul min haTorah. Moshe, writing in the 60s, suggests that microwaves were up and coming. It was going to become a normal way to cook. And so maybe it would be Bishul min haTorah. Now, the truth is, even today, it's not normal to cook in a microwave. People don't usually put raw food and cook it up in a microwave. People use microwaves for reheating. And therefore, even Rav Moshe would agree that it wouldn't be considered Bishul min haTorah in a microwave. But suffice it to say, it is permitted to cook in the sun.
So you mentioned solar heating as an example for heating through the sun or heating using the sun. Is it really permitted to use solar heating on Shabbos? Is that considered heating directly from the sun?
That's a great question and big discussion in the poskim in the 20th century where solar heating, especially in Israel, became very common. But there's another consideration we need to have, and that is something called toldos hachama. That something that's heated not directly in the sun, but heated by something that was heated by the sun. The Gemara says that even though you're allowed to fry an egg, let's say directly in the sun on the roof of a car, however, to heat something in something that was heated by the sun, that would be a problem. Why? Because if you cooked it in toldos ha'or, if you cook in something that was heated by the fire, that is actually cooking min haTorah. Let's say you take the Gemara example is a cloth. You heat up a cloth in the fire, or you heat up a cloth in the sun, it looks exactly the same afterwards, that hot cloth, and therefore the Gemara says that it's asur midirabanan to cook in things that were heated by the sun. And that leads to the big question with the solar heating. Maybe the water is considered heated through the solar panels, that's toldos hachama. Additionally, perhaps more problematically, the way it works, it goes into a big tank of water that was heated by the sun. Cold water is heated by the tank is toldos hachama, and therefore be potentially a problem to heat the water in the solar heaters. That being said, there are poskim who are mekel, but many, the Shmir Shabbos, Kilchasa, paskin, that one should refrain from using the solar heated water on Shabbos.
Okay, so secondary heat from the sun might be problematic because it's more like secondary heat of fire, which is totally not permitted. So what exactly is secondary heat from fire?
Obviously, when we talk about cooking, we're talking about cooking something on the fire. That is for sure a problem in haTorah. The Gemara, however, however, notes that a kli rishon that's not on the fire, namely, if you have a pot of water, let's say, that was cooked on the fire, and that pot is removed from the fire, it would still be considered bishul to place something raw inside of that pot. Kli rishon is bishul min ha-Torah. This is in contrast, the Gemara says, to kli sheni. If you would pour that water into another pot, that second pot wouldn't be considered bishul min ha-Torah. Why is this distinction true? It's not exactly clear. Tosfos has a very interesting comment, which seems to form the basis of this halacha, as we'll see soon. But Tosfos notes that the difference between them is not necessarily in the temperature of the water. You can measure the temperature; it could be the same in a kli rishon and a kli sheni. The difference is that in a kli rishon, the walls of the pot are hot. The pot itself was sitting on the fire. However, in a kli sheni, the walls of the pot are cold, and the idea seems to be that things are heading in the hot direction on a kli rishon, but things are cooling down in the kli sheni, and therefore it would not be considered bishul there. So that's a distinction the Gemara makes.
Okay, interesting. So even though the heat, the temperature might be the same, there's still a big difference between what we call a kli rishon and a kli sheni. So what exactly can we do with a kli sheni, for example?
The Gemara says kli sheni ein mavashel. There's no cooking in a kli sheni. However, there's a Mishnah that says very clearly that certain foods, certain salty fish, do get cooked in a kli sheni. And the question is how to resolve this. So what post can explain is that the general rule is that a kli sheni ein mavashel. It's cooling down. It's not going to be able to cook. However, there are certain foods that are kalei habishel that are cooked very easily. They don't require a lot of cooking to be prepared, and therefore in those there is a problem of bishul even in a kli sheni. So the most famous application of this issue is tea. Is tea considered kalei habishul or not? Now a little background: the Gemara has a few examples of things that we know don't get cooked in a kli sheni. So the Gemara's examples are water, oil, and spices. The Gemara talks about, and we have the salty fish that the Mishnah tells us does get cooked in a kli sheni. And the question is what to do with everything in between. So the Mishnah Brura and others asking that since we're not sure of how to define these things and we're potentially dealing with a shaila violating Shabbos min ha-Torah, so the Mishnah Brura says we have to be strict about almost all foods except for those that we know for sure don't cook in a kli sheni. So water can be put in a kli sheni, oil can be put in a kli sheni, but other things we're not sure, we have to be machmir, and therefore the Mishnah Brura spends a lot of time explaining different options of how to make tea because putting it in a kli sheni might be a problem of kalei habishul. Before getting to what the Mishnah Brura says about tea, as I mentioned, the Gemara says that water doesn't get cooked in a kli sheni, and this is very helpful if you want to get some warm water for a baby, or you want to put some ice in soup, something like that. Anytime you're dealing with a kli sheni, you're not in the original pot where the water was cooked on the fire, but you're in a bottle, you're in a cup, you're in a bowl of soup. That's for sure a kli sheni. It is permitted to put water in there, even cold water, so you can put the ice in the soup, and you can put some cold water, mix it in with the hot water, because water is definitely not considered kalei habishul. So that is a helpful point to know. But other than that, we pretty much have to be strict that anything might be kalei habishul. This is the opinion of the Mishnah Brura. And so therefore, in discussing tea, the Mishnah Brura suggests that you make tea essence. Now, Tuvia, I know you're a bigger tea drinker than I am. In a minute, I want you to explain to the crowd how you make the tea essence. But before we get there, Moshe Feinstein does have a different opinion. And Moshe Feinstein says that if you get something to kli shlishi, so it's not the pot that was cooked on the fire, and it's not the next pot or bowl that it's in, but it's a third one, then that is not mevashel, and you're allowed to do whatever you want to the kli shlishi. Whoever agrees with Moshe. And the reason for this dispute is that the Gemara never talks about a kli shlishi. The Gemara talks about a kli rishon and a kli sheni. The question is, what is the status of the kli shlishi? Moshe Feinstein's view is the Gemara doesn't talk about it because the kli shlishi is for sure mutter. There's nothing to talk about. There's definitely no bishul on a kli shlishi. Others argue that no, the Gemara says kli rishon and kli sheni because it's kli sheni and anything beyond the kli sheni would have the same status. Namely, it normally doesn't cook. However, if it's a kalei bishul situation like tea, which we see, it's cooked up very easily, so then it would be considered bishul. So that is machlokas again. The Mishnah Brura follows the view that one cannot simply rely on a kli shlishi to make tea. However, Moshe Feinstein does paskin that you can use a kli shlishi, and there are different practices until today in different homes how to prepare tea. With the tea essence, you do have to be a little bit careful, so I'm going to turn it over to Tuvia to give a little tutorial on the tea essence.
Like you mentioned, so there's different ways to make tea on Shabbos. One is by using a kli shlishi. Another one is making tea essence before Shabbos. Basically what you do is you take the tea bag, put it into a pot, into a cup, or whatever. You put hot water in it before Shabbos to make sure that it gets boiled, it gets cooked within that little teapot. And then on Shabbos, you pour your hot water into a cup and you add into that the tea essence. We'll get to next week is the concepts of irui and what should you do first. Put in the essence first and then the water, or the water first and then the essence. Big difference between the two. And we'll have to discuss that more in next week's talk.
As you said, Tuvia, there's still lots to talk about on this topic, so looking forward to continuing next week.
Amazing. So we'll talk then.
For more short and fast-paced Talking Torah clips, make sure to check out our YouTube channel.